Good evening. I'm Rachel Dwoskin. I teach fiction here in the Committee on Creative Writing, and it's an honor to be here tonight. In her memoir, Brother, I'm Dying, Edwidge Danticat writes of her uncle Joseph after a laryngectomy that leaves him with a hole in his neck, and therefore the embarrassed object of attention, curious and sometimes cruel. All I could think to do was imagine a wall around him, a romancing fortress that would follow him everywhere he went and shield him from derision. In a feat of artistic transcendence, what Danticat does instead of constructing the wall of her childhood imagination, cloud cloaked in cotton candy pink, is render her uncle, family, and Haiti with such depth, humanity, and precision that she gives us a kaleidoscopic view of the country and of love, frankly, through whatever walls blocked our ability to see. Her work contains and doesn't flinch away from even our worst impulses and most violent behaviors. It tries to understand them, to explore why human beings are who we are, why we do what we do. It achieves the poetic truth Aristotle identifies when he distinguishes between historians, whose domain is the what in what happened, and artists like Danticat, whose domain is a deep investigation of what must have happened because of the rules of probability, cause and effect, in other words, the why. And in Danticat's work, an expression of who, at our very cores, human beings are. That her uncle Joseph, at 81 years of age, makes his way to the United States, hoping for safe asylum from the gang violence that has forced him to flee his church and city of Bel Air, first gives us hope that America will be a sanctuary. That the beloved man who once said of someone else, she attracts bad, but she's not a bad person, will be spared more brutality and suffering. But instead, Joseph is detained and tormented by U.S. Customs officials, dead within days of his arrival, in one of the most excruciating and moving stories I've ever read. This is one of the endings of the book, a brutal, important one, as essential reading now as it ever has been. But before she closes the story, Danticat writes in, generously, beautifully, and without sentimentality, the story of the birth of her daughter, Mira, named for Danticat's father, who dies less than a year after his brother Joseph, but not before he holds his granddaughter and acknowledges that even when he has gone, the name will stay behind. This is what writing does when it's most profound, leaves its truths with us to keep. And in Danticat's work, it gives a breathtaking, otherwise inaccessible view of Haiti, of the sweep and scope of a nation's history, full of horror, but also beauty, one that lets us bear witness and requires that we look in the mirror at America. That her books do this radical work by way of stories as humane as the ones she creates can feel astonishing. The luminous, motherless child at the center of Danticat's novel, Claire of the Sea Light, is like a bright sun around whom the other characters and their stories orbit. And those are full at once of violence, tenderness, and the fiber and meter of actual human life, heightened but real. In one of the novel's most stunning moments, Gael, a fabric merchant pregnant with a baby she has been told by doctors will not survive, eats a decaying frog during a plague of frogs exploding in the seaside town's unbearable heat. She imagines, though the frog is dead, that it's struggling in her throat. She swallows it. Danticat writes, "Here they were," she thought, drawing the thought out in her mind. Two types of animals were now inside her in peril. Her daughter, Rose, and now this frog. Let them fight it out and see who will win. There are battles inside all of us, magnified and mirrored by the wars our cities endure. And yet there are also moments when our lives and cities are bathed in light and we forget what made us feel frail or ruined. There are our mother's voices coming through the thin walls as they do in Breath, Eyes, Memory, saying, I am not having the short breath anymore, but every so often I do find myself dreaming the bad dreams. I thought it would end, but lately it seems to be beginning all over again. As Danticat asks in Claire of the Sea Light, how do you even choose what to mend when so much has already been destroyed? By showing the destruction itself as well as its root human causes, Danticat does masterful work toward mending. An artist who comes from a culture that fits her own description in Create Dangerously, one as much about harnessing life, joyous, jubilant, resilient life, as it is about avoiding death. She creates fully realized human beings, full of all the nuance and complexity required to rebuild. Her work is a call to us all to listen, to ask, to look closely at our own lives and the lives of others, and finally to create, dangerously and courageously, toward a more just and perceptive world. Edwidge Danticat's books include Crick Crack, Breath, Eyes, Memory, The Farming of Bones, Brother, I'm Dying, Create Dangerously, Claire of the Sea Light, Untwine, and the forthcoming The Art of Death, Writing the Final Story. She has won awards and prizes including a MacArthur Genius Grant, a National Book Critics Circle Award, a Langston Hughes Medal, and honorary degrees from Smith and Yale universities, among many others. She is a namer of people, places, eras, and human realities. The names stay behind. The people she creates become part of us and our own memories and understandings of the world, the way only the most memorably rendered characters can. I am so grateful for her work, and that we have her here tonight at the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming the inimitable Edwidge Danticat.
Good evening. Bonsoir. Thank you, Rachel, so much for that beautiful and extraordinarily thoughtful introduction. Rachel mentioned that I have a book coming out this July called The Art of Death. This is what it will look like. So I thought I would talk a little bit first and then I'll read from it. The Art of Death is part of a series that Grey Wolf Press, they're an amazing press. They've published Claudia Rankine, among other people, and Percival Everett. And so they have a series that's edited by Charles Baxter called The Art Of. Usually it's the series, it's a writer reflecting on a subject. It's usually part memoir, part literary criticism, and part craft book. I actually sought them out to ask if I could write one after reading a couple of them. My mom had just passed away and I was having trouble, reading really or writing. And so I thought this would be a good way to get back into that whole process again. And it was a very healing process for me. The epigraph that I use in the book is from Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient. The main character, reflecting on the woman he loves, says, "We die containing a richness of lovers and tribes, taste we have swallowed, bodies we have plunged into and swum up as if rivers of wisdom, characters we have climbed into as if trees, fears we have hidden as if in caves. I wish for all this to be marked on my body when I am dead. I believe in such cartography to be marked by nature, not just to label ourselves on a map like the names of rich men and women on buildings. We're all communal histories, communal books." This is one of the foundations of this book and in the talk. And the other is the death of my mother and figuring out how to grieve while trying to get back into writing. So I read tons of books. Some of the books I'd read before and others that were new to me, and books that people gave me. I got a lot, for example, of copies from friends of C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. I got Zora Neale Hurston's autobiography in which she talks about her mother, which is also part of this talk. And then I started reading my own books in the way I've been writing about death in a new way, and I realized that I was kind of a serial killer in my books. I had lost people close to me, but I felt like maybe if these things had happened sooner, I might not have written about death in the same way. There were some lessons I pulled from the way we live with death, and coming from a culture where there are a lot of rituals involving death, for example, wearing black after your loved ones had died. I found, for example, after my mother died, people really expected me to go so much quickly back into life. There were no mourning periods, and after the funeral, people give you maybe like a week, and then they're just calling you again. And so I think there's so little that we know in terms of how to interact with people after that. But in terms of approaching death for writers, from the point of view of a writer, one of the things that I learned in writing the book that in many ways a lot of us are writing our obituaries as we're going along, because there's so much of us online. When people die these days, if their Facebook stays open, people are still interacting with them, So now when we say the dead are always with us, we're not kidding. They're always in our pockets, in our smartphones. I have an acquaintance in Miami who died very young of lung cancer, and every year on his birthday, people go on his Facebook and talk to him. So a lot of things in the past that our relatives or even strangers might have not had access to are out there in the open. The other thing is, as a writer facing the whole subject of death, is that I realized that a lot of writing about death is writing about life. In order to mourn, we have to realize, have lived with them. One of the people I talk about in the book is Christopher Hitchens. He, in his last days, he was writing essays for Vanity Fair that were compiled in a book called Mortality. And he wrote, "I don't have a body, I am a body. We're all bodies, but the dying body starts decaying right before our eyes." Having people who are talking, who are writing from within that dying body is an exceptional thing. So the piece that I'll read starts with Zora Neale Hurston and ends with my mother, and it's a chapter in the book called Circles and Circles of Sorrow. It is said that when the writer Zora Neale Hurston was a little girl, she loved a Greek myth about a wrestler named Antaeus. Antaeus was the son of Poseidon, god of the seas, and Gaia, goddess of the earth. Antaeus would win all his wrestling matches as long as he remained connected to the earth and his feet were touching the ground. Only Hercules was intelligent enough to defeat him by keeping his feet off the ground until he lost all his strength. Both Antaeus' strengths and weaknesses must have intrigued young Zora. The idea that being rooted or tied to the earth could empower even a god might have fascinated her. That rootlessness could lead to defeat and possibly death may have also frightened her. When Zora Neale Hurston was a child, after she'd wandered off too many times, her mother, Lucy Hurston, suspected a neighbor of having sprinkled travel dust on the family doorstep on the day Zora was born. If she had her way, Zora wrote in her autobiography, Dust Tracked on a Road, she meant to raise her children to stay at home. Still, Zora's headstrong mother encouraged her 8 children to jump at the sun. They might not land on the sun, she told them, but at least they would get off the ground. The contrast between Antaeus' predicament and Zora's mother's advice to jump at the sun must have appeared less contradictory when Zora's mother suddenly died when Zora was 13 years old. There are some beautiful rituals involving death and dying in the southern African American communities of Zora's time. African-based customs which Zora Neale Hurston would later document in her anthropological work. In Zora's community, before the dead took their last breaths, pillows were to be removed from under their heads in order to make their transitions easier. Clocks and mirrors were to be covered to allow time to stand still and to stop departing spirits from seeing their reflections and staying put. Coins were placed over the eyelids of the deceased or in their hands as an offering for their entry into the afterworld. Before she died, Zora's mother told her not to let anyone remove the pillow from under her head. She also told Zora not to let the clocks and mirrors be covered. But soon, in another ritual involving the dying, Lucy Hurston's bed was turned around and her eyes were facing east towards the rising sun. I thought she looked at me as the head of the bed was reversed, Zora wrote. Her mouth was slightly open, but her breathing took up so much of her strength that she couldn't talk. But she looked at me, or so I felt, to speak for her. She depended on me for a voice. That voice immediately began to both personalize and mythologize death. In order to explain death to herself, young Zora made a story out of it. That's what many of us do when the people we love die, especially, I believe, when our mothers die. Reading other daughters' accounts of their mothers' deaths, a genre that some have reductively called memoirs, from Zora Neale Hurston's and Dust Tracks on a Road to Simone de Beauvoir's A Very Easy Death, to Mary Gordon's Circling My Mother and others. I sometimes feel as though we are all daughters of the same mythical mother. Some of us are super direct, intellectual, funny. Others are pensive, inquisitive, maudlin, bitter, sarcastic, or a combination of all of these things. Yet we have all been orphaned, except by our words, which we eventually turn to in order to make sense of the impossible, the unknowable. We want to write not just our mothers' deaths, but of their lives too. and of the ways beyond the obvious that their lives and ours were linked. We want to share the connections that we have built with our mothers, be it through books, clothes, or words. We want to write of the disconnections too. We want to write our mothers not only as our mothers, but as people, lovers, women, who had a beginning that did not include us, but who are now pulling us into their ending with them. Writing, we hope, might make all of this easier to grasp, even though we cannot change the outcome. While I am reading these other writer daughters' accounts of their mothers' deaths, their mothers become my mother, and my mother, and all her similar travails, become theirs. Among the places our stories differ, aside from specific and singular details, is how much our mothers suffered. My mother was mercifully gone 6 months after she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. This is the way she would have wanted it. She had always said, after we'd returned from the funeral of someone who died suddenly, she would neither want to have a sudden death nor suffer through a long illness. She wanted something in between, just enough time to put her affairs in order and get a few things off her chest. She got her wish. Not everyone gets theirs. The master maker and his making had made old death, Zora Neale Hurston recalled thinking on the day her mother died. Made him with big, soft feet and square toes, made him with a face that reflects the face of all things. On the day that we were born, our mother's face was the face that reflected all things. She was for that brief moment when they first tucked us into her arms, or pressed her breast into our mouth, everything to us. Mama died at sundown and changed a world, Zora Neale Hurston wrote in Dust Tracks on a Road. That is, the world which had been built out of her body and her heart. Zora Neale Hurston's mother's death reactivated her travel dust, and as she traveled the world, she believed that her mother's ghost was shadowing her. She felt guilty most of her life that she'd been unable to keep those promises to her mother on her deathbed, to hold a pillow in place, and to keep the clock and mirror in her room uncovered. Another Greco-Roman Greek myth Zora Neale Hurston liked was about Persephone, the goddess of springtime and queen of the underworld. When Hades, the god of death, kidnaps Persephone and takes her to the underworld, the world above dries up because Persephone's mother, Demeter, is so grief-stricken that she abandons her duties as global gardener, keeping the world's plants and flowers alive. But when Persephone returns from the underworld, the world blooms again because Persephone's mother is happy. Perhaps Zora Neale Hurston saw in her mother Lucy a version of Persephone who is so missed when she's gone that the world literally starts to die. This type of grief, as Toni Morrison writes in Sula, has no top and bottom, just circles and circles of sorrow. A year before her death, my mother finally started losing weight. She gave up her fatty foods and sweets and went to herbalists who sold her pills and herbs that were supposed to regulate her digestion. In addition to all of this, she was seeing her primary physician in New York every 3 months. The weight flying off seemed like a reward for good behavior. The only downside was that my mother, who now weighed less than me, was burping all the time, as if there was thunder trapped inside her shrinking body. At Christmas time, I invited her to come spend the holidays with me and my family in Miami. At first, she said no. Her birthday was 3 days after Christmas, and she wanted to spend it at her home in Brooklyn. She changed her mind right before Christmas and came to Miami. On Christmas Day, she cooked a lavish dinner, of which she ate little. She ate even less at her birthday dinner 3 days later, when we took her to one of her favorite Haitian restaurants. I took my mother to see my physician friend, Rosemay, right after New Year's. I spotted the alarmed look on Rosemay's face as soon as she touched my mother's stomach, which in spite of her weight loss, was twice its usual size. Rosemay took my hand and guided it to a spot near my mother's expanded belly button, which felt like a well-polished rock. Rosemay immediately started writing down a list of tests my mother would need. Each test led to another more complicated test, and slowly both Mom and I realized that we were not on a quest to disprove something bad, but on an exposition to identify how bad it was. For a long time, I would only refer to it as a mass, not a tumor or cancer. That is until Rosemary got all the test results and sat my mother down and explained the sizes and the staging and how cancer is not always a mass, but how it's sometimes like a blanket over organs or chains that trap them, and how cancer can always become cut out, but at times only minimally reduced. I thought my mother would burst into tears, but she did not. She listened attentively and nodded. Her face betrayed no trace of fright or panic. She was still. In the car on the way home after that meeting with Rosemary, my mother and I were both lost in a terrible silence which should have been filled with tears. At a red light where I stopped for too long, my mother spoke up for the first time since we'd heard the news and warned, "Don't suddenly become a zombie. Pas bintou non zombie, non?" She was telling me not to lose my good sense, to keep my head on my shoulders. Later, I would align this moment with something I had long ago read by Zora Neale Hurston. In the 1930s, while doing anthropological fieldwork in Haiti, Hurston claimed to have come in contact with an actual zombie, a woman named Felicia Felix Mator. She even offered a photograph as proof. Dressed in a loose-fitting and shabby frock, Felicia's eyes were glazed in a way that made her look blind. Her hair was closely cropped, and even though she was standing up in the picture, she looked the same way as she might look in a coffin. The supposed zombie must remain a mystery, and Felicia looked like one, haggard and lost. The zombie's inner spiritual geography had been erased by death, but the body is still forced to wander the earth. This is the kind of life and death nobody wants, a painfully eternal living death. Of this alleged zombie, Hurston wrote, "How did this woman, supposedly dead for 29 years, come to be wandering naked on a road? If my mother came wandering down a road naked 20 years from now, I would still want her," I thought in the car that day. This was the first time I understood why anyone would have their loved ones frozen through cryonics or some other method, so they could be revived at some point in the future. Then again, maybe C.S. Lewis was right. Wouldn't it be awful to die and come back, only to have to die all over again? Maybe all the Lazaruses of the world would have an even harder time dying than the rest of us. According to Haitian folklore, one way zombies can be liberated from their living death is by eating salt. People who suddenly receive terrible news are also given salt, and coffee, for example, to ward off the saisissement, or the shock. When we got home from Rosemary's office that day, my mother made us each a small cup of coffee that she sprinkled with salt. I was talking to my mother when she died. She was visibly slipping away. She was no longer eating or drinking. Her skin was cool, even though she complained of feeling warm. "Open the window," she'd say, meaning the sliding glass door next to the hospital bed she was now sleeping in my house. The hospital bed prevented me from sleeping next to her at night, which is something I had begun to do regularly since she got sick. Her eyes were glazed as she drifted in and out of consciousness the afternoon she died. It was close to 1 o'clock. "I love you, mon aimant," I told her over and over. I held her hand, I kissed her face, stroked the salt and pepper stub that was left of her unusually thick and woolly hair. "You're a wonderful mother," I told her. Hearing, they say, is one of the last senses to go. My mother smiled. I tearfully asked her, "Mommy, uka we ciel la? Mommy, can you see heaven?" She smiled again, then she was gone. There was no death rattle, no sudden intake or output of air. She simply stopped breathing. She smiled and slipped away. Smiling while dying is apparently not that unusual. The body tries to produce a state of euphoria to usher us out. It releases the same kind of neurochemicals that it floods our brains with as we are falling in love. My mother's face stilled. Rather than tighten and rigor mortis, it seemed relaxed. One of the things I had told her at the last minute in my rush of words and tears was to let go. "Umet lage, mama, you can let go, mama." I said it's okay to let go. She had let go. Her previously balled fists were now wide open. I lifted her hands and folded them over her chest. I reached down and closed her eyes. I was afraid they'd pop up again, but they stayed closed. I kept my face pressed against my mother's right cheek for a few minutes, and I cried. I realize I'm writing this in circles. This is the only way it makes sense to me now. For in grief, nothing stays put, C.S. Lewis wrote in A Grief Observed. One keeps emerging from a phase, but it always reoccurs, round and round, everything repeats. Am I going in circles, or dare I hope I am on a spiral? Soon after my mother died, I was talking to a writer friend who told me that she had a couple of stories in mind that she will only be able to write after her mother dies. I wonder what these stories will be for me now. Eventually, this will be one of them. A few months after my mother died, I was asked to write a prayer for a panel I was participating in at the Penn World Voices International Writers Festival in New York. I had procrastinated for as long as I could until the morning when I was supposed to send the prayer so it could be printed in a small book that would be distributed at the event. I grew up in houses where we prayed all the time. First at my minister's uncle's house in Haiti, then with my parents and brothers in Brooklyn. Yet it was hard for me to write a prayer. This is in part because I believe prayers are meant to be private, since they often reflect our most vital desires. I used to tell myself that writing is a kind of prayer, that silence can be prayer, that even children are prayers, living and growing prayers, that love is the most powerful prayer of all. Yet the prayer I ended up writing was inspired by my mother. It is the prayer I imagine her saying in her head during her final moments on this earth, during the final minutes when she couldn't speak anymore, but could still hear a little bit as she was drifting away. My mother had a singular and wicked sense of humor, one that's hard to convey in translation. Her type of humor was mostly for intimates, or people she'd quickly made into intimates. Her jokes were best understood by people who already knew how she spoke, who could read her body language and listen for the nuances in her speech. When my mother was occasionally hospitalized, most of the nurses who took care of her were also from Haiti. My mother was hesitant to ask too much of them, but she would joke with them in Haitian Creole. To one nurse who always had trouble drawing her blood, she said, "It's too bad you're not like the people on TV who just put their teeth on someone's neck and get blood from there. Maybe there's still some blood left in my neck." To the one who had to extract feces from her rectum when she was impacted, she said, "For your sake, my sister, I wish I had swallowed a big piece of gold earlier this morning." Listening to her cackle, even as her care became more humiliating, made me realize how hard she was trying to keep a part of herself intact, even though it was a side of her she rarely made public. The nurses would laugh and continue their work, and my mother would laugh between occasional groans of pain, as if she never wanted the joke to end. At my father's funeral 10 years before, my mother kept whispering something under her breath. Finally, at the gravesite, I leaned over to hear what she was saying. She was muttering over and over, "Jusqu'à ce que la mort nous sépare, until death do us part. Jusqu'à ce que la mort nous sépare, until death do us part." This moved me so much that I asked her why she was saying that. And she told me that she was reminding my father that their contract had been terminated, that she had only signed up for until one of them was dead, and that she didn't want my father to now come back and bother her anymore. This is why I know my mother will not haunt me. She will not be a ghost, because she was afraid of ghosts. My mother wouldn't have been funny in English, even though she'd lived in the United States for decades. Her English sounded like a newly arrived immigrant's English. Part of it was shyness. The other part was her lack of practice. There was not much English spoken in the factories where she worked. Everyone there had come from someplace else. She was embarrassed to speak English in other settings as well. She worried that she wouldn't be understood. Her English was hesitant and inadvertently curt. She used as few words as possible, as though trying not to squander them. I gave her a few more English words than she might have used in this prayer. I tried to bring in her humor too. I called my prayer a new sky. This is the prayer. Dear Lord, please let this be my final prayer, my very final prayer. Let there be no more need for me to ask anything of you or of the shaken and troubled but beautiful earth. Let this be the last time I think of you before we see each other face to face, light to light, or wind to wind, sky to sky, or however we will be. I can't wait. I can't wait to see what we will be, what colors, what shade, what light pillar, what rainbow, what moonbow, what sunbow, what glory, or what new sky. Let me now accept all of this as I've already accepted this world and all that it is and has been. And please let the world go on. Let the sun still rise and set. Let the rain still fall, quiet and soft at times, and hard at other times. Let the oceans be still or war as they always have. Let the world go on as it always has, so that my children will know that only my spark has dimmed and not the entire world. Let my children remember me, both the good and bad of me. Let them not forget one thing about me that could help them be one better woman and 3 better men. Please let the pain rocking my body stop. Let it stop right now. Let my lungs stop aching. Let my breath stop sounding like hammers in my ear. Let me not say anything hateful at this final hour. Please let my daughter stop crying. Let it be a sunny day when they bury me. And please let my children find the $500 I left in the tin can in the freezer. I should have told them about that when I still could. Don't let them throw away my good blender either. All it needs is a new blade. Or maybe you can make my children forget all the times I spanked them. There might not be much to be gained from that. Let them say nice things about me at my funeral, things I have never heard them say before, things I would never imagine them even thinking about me, things that have nothing to do with being spanked. Don't let them go on talking for too long either. Let them shut up when it's time. And let them know that I have always been praying for them like this, silently in my head, and that if it's at all possible, I will never stop praying for them like this, silently from somewhere else. Please remind them that none of us have all the time we think we have in this troubled but beautiful world. Let them not bury me in an ugly dress. Guide them to my good wig. I really should have told my daughter where it was. Let them not be talked out of a closed coffin. I now only want you to see my face. And please let my children survive this. Let them survive this, for I will not just be their mama now. I will be their light pillar, their rainbow, their moonbow, their sunbow, their glory, their new sky. A year to the day after my mother died, I dreamed that I woke up shaking after realizing that I had abandoned her in a hospice ward for a week and had completely forgotten about her. In the dream, I jumped out of bed and rushed to the hospital, panicked that my mother had been buried without anyone she loved saying goodbye. The hospice room in my dream looked a lot like the one my mother had actually stayed in. In my dream, when I walk into that room, I find someone who looks like my mother standing by her bed, waiting for me. She looks like she did in her coffin at her funeral, thin, though not as haggard, and with layers upon layers of dark pancake makeup on her face. In my dream, she's wearing a long black wig and a short cocktail dress with silver sequins in the front, and before I can hug her, she begins rocking herself, then starts dancing a slow, mournful dance. As she's dancing, I realize that she doesn't recognize me. I suddenly don't recognize her either. I can't figure out who the woman I'm looking at is, but she is not my mother. So I quickly turn around and walk out of that room without saying goodbye. In the hallway outside the hospice room, I mumble a few words to myself about a purse. A purse? Oh yeah. A few months before, among my mother's things, I had found a beautiful purse. My mother was very fond of purses. She also liked church hats, but had more purses than church hats. Maybe it was because she used to make purses in the factories where she worked. In any case, she liked having purses around. Most of the handbags and purses I found in her house in New York and eventually ended up giving away had pieces of hard caramel candy tucked in the pockets, along with bus fare, $2 worth of coins, individually wrapped, and paper napkins. Out of my mother's dozens of purses, I had only kept a few and had only one on the night table by my bed. It was a seashell-shaped vintage purse covered with gray and silver beads. The two-headed metal clasp clicked loudly when you opened and closed it. The inside was lined with gold-colored silk that had faded in some places. It had gotten browner in others. Inside a tiny pocket, I saw the number 2 written in black permanent marker. Then I realized that this purse had cost my mother $2 at the Goodwill near the diagnostic center where she'd had some of her early tests, the same Goodwill where she and I would browse through shelves and bins searching for such treasures. Somehow that purse makes its way into my dream, and as I walk away from the dancing woman in the hospice ward, the woman who was not really my mother, I begin to talking to my mother about that purse. Mama, sa se busu, I mutter under my breath. Mama, this is your purse. It is a purse inside a dream, as if there's nothing left for it to carry in the real world. But I am still carrying it like I'm still carrying you. Mama, I miss you. Mama, I love you. Mama, t'en prie reposer. Please rest. Goodbye. Thank you.